All right, so I'm going through the Discourse on Method by Descartes using this nifty Hackett edition here. And I may devote this entire video to being an interlude summarizing, the structure of his life and to some extent the structure of his book. Now, this book, the Discourse on Method, is autobiographical. But he suggests early on, let's review page 1, 2, 3 in this edition, the first part of the book. He suggests that this book is merely a story, or if you prefer, a fable. Later he says something about how fables awaken the mind. So I hesitate to say he's simply a filthy liar, but at least until I have better evidence that he's lying as such, I certainly don't trust this guy very much. He is sneaky. He's shady. He's very sneaky with what he chooses to say, what he chooses to leave out, and how he presents it, what he says, what words he uses, and how he arranges it. So, what is he saying about the story of his life? How does it connect to the structure of this book? How does it connect to his strategy for finding the method for conducting our reason well? Remember, the whole point of the book is to find the method that we can all use so that reason can be done properly. Reason is the human ability to distinguish true from false and make good judgments, and everyone has it, but we're not always using reason properly. So we need a better method. So this book is about his lifelong quest for the method and what he eventually figured out with it. But I'm noticing something I've rarely paid attention to before that might be pretty important, and that is that you can actually identify two methods. They're connected. They're closely related, and you might say one is a precursor to the other. In fact, that's probably a good way of saying it. One is an early version of the other. But he spends a full, I think it was a full 9 years of his life, as he tells the story in this book. Descartes spent a full 9 years of his life applying the method he came up with in the stove-heated room before he ever even got to his famous method of doubt. So I want to clarify that. So let me state, first of all, that there is a structure to Descartes' life, and you can divide it into different stages, and you can connect these to the different parts of the book. So, first stage of his life is childhood and education, and that's what he talks about in part 1 of the book. And then there is the time spent studying the great book of the world, as he describes it. Now, you could, if you wanted to, combine these into one stage: early quest for knowledge and early failures to find knowledge, if you wanted to phrase it that way. And let's see, I think those are both topics in book 1, part 1 of the book. Yeah, they're both in part 1. So part 1 describes, as I'm phrasing it, first 2 stages of his life: his childhood and education, and then his time spent studying the great book of the world. Review what he says in part 1, towards the end of part 1, last 2 paragraphs about what the great book of the world is and how he studies it. So in part 1 of the book, stage 1 of his life, childhood and education; stage 2, time spent studying the great book of the world, and in both of them he fails to find knowledge. And then, third stage of his life is just 1 day long, and it's the day he spent in the stove-heated room. And that covers parts 2 and 3 of the Discourse on Method. Now let me make sure. Yeah, I was thinking there was a little bit of time. Yes, there's a long stage of his life that's also in part 3. So, stage 1 of his life, childhood and education, where he fails to find knowledge. Stage 2, time spent studying the great book of the world, where he also fails to find knowledge, and that's also in part 1. Those are both in part 1 of the Discourse on Method. Then the third stage of his life is the day he spent in the stove-heated room, sitting and thinking and coming up with rules for pursuing knowledge properly. And that third stage is the subject of parts 2 and 3 of the Discourse on Method. But the end of part 3 covers the fourth stage of his life. And the fourth stage of his life is 9 years he spent following the method and the rules he'd come up with in the stove-heated room. So, the method of doubt applied in part 4, or described in part 4 of the book, is the 5th stage of Descartes' life. And then I think we can just, loosely speaking, say the 6th stage of his life is touting Cartesian philosophy, writing all these books and responding to critics and so on. So, stage 1, childhood and education, fails to find knowledge, part 1 of the Discourse. Stage 2, Time spent studying the great book of the world also fails to find knowledge. Part 1 of the Discourse. Stage 3, day in a stove-heated room. Part 2 of the Discourse and most of Part 3 of the Discourse, where he finds a method and some rules for gaining knowledge. Stage, or at least getting rid of false beliefs. Stage 4, 9 years he spends applying that method and living by those rules he came up with in parts 2 and 3 of the Discourse. But he describes those years in part 3 of the Discourse towards the end. Stage 5 of his life, the method of doubt, part 4 of the Discourse. Stage 6, touting Cartesian philosophy. And this is when he wrote all this down, and this is when this is the sort of stuff he describes in parts 5 and 6. Although I shouldn't say touting Cartesian philosophy, I should say promoting Cartesian philosophy. So there you go. The parts of the book go over the stages of his life in this way, and the whole point is to find the right method for gaining knowledge, for getting rid of false beliefs and achieving true beliefs. But the method is not fully developed until part 4 of the Discourse, and there's a passage in part 3 where he describes an earlier version of the method, which he spent working on for a full 9 years. All right, enough. We'll get back to the text in the next video. Thanks for watching.